Okay, thank you. Thank you all for inviting us this evening. The presentation is based on my thematic collection on parachuting, which has so far taken me 30 years. So this is just a small selection of some of the bits. I thought I usually start by telling you why parachuting, because I'm often asked why parachuting. And very simply, when I was somewhat younger, 4 decades younger, I thought it'd be a whizzy idea to have a go at parachuting. I did 6 parachute jumps, static line jumps, and I can't, because there's a lady present, tell you what my instructor said, but basically I was not very good. And his opinion was, what's the right word, confirmed on my 6th and last parachute jump when, this is in Ipswich. Ipswich Field is a big grass field, and it's so big the council have football pitches on the far side of the runway, and I could never get the hang of steering a parachute. And well, shall we say, the goalkeeper did ask me to remove my 28 foot of silk from his parachute, and the referee decided that I should go quickly for my own safety. And in the corner of my eye, I could see the parachute club owner running across the runway, suggesting if I was to put any hole in his parachute, he'd put a hole in me. I decided to retire at that point, and I thought that was a wise decision. And I gave up parachuting and flew instead, which is a whole other story, but that's why parachuting. So parachute material, often, or has been in the past, silk. You all know the story of silk, the caterpillar, the cocoon, with lots and lots of small silk threads which are carefully unwound after boiling them alive, I believe, which sounds very jolly. Silk has been around for obviously a long time, very expensive. In the 19th century, Chardonnay from France invented his replacement silk, which had the unfortunate habit of bursting into flame, which wasn't very jolly for the ladies wearing the dresses at the time, I suspect. But shortly afterwards, rayon came along, which was an artificial silk, and many parachutes are made of rayon. Some were still made with silk, but it was very expensive in comparison. Why silk? Well, silk, as I'm sure you all know, you can crunch it up and it doesn't crease. You can crunch it up for a long period of time and unpack it and it does what it's meant to do. If it gets wet, it doesn't lose its shape and will dry very quickly. I'm often asked, why did the military always use white parachutes? Well, parachuting was so young, they hadn't had time to experiment with different dyes which have a reaction with the silk. What they were frightened of was somebody opening their parachute and find that all bits had come off it because they dyed it green or blue or whatever, and the dye had an adverse reaction to the silk. So they kept silk and white for many years. Well, one of my nice items, which you may have some interest in, is on the right-hand side there, a Dickerson paper proposal for the 1 penny letter sheet. And I know it's hard to see, but the vertical lines up here are the inlaid silk, just inside there. There's about 6 or 7 of them across there. There's another one there. It's so, I tried a few times, but that's about the best image I can get. So they have been around in post office use for a little while. Early parachuting. Well, there's some evidence that circus performers in the 11th and 12th century in China would use what today we'd recognize as something like an umbrella or parachute-like to help them perform jumping stunts. The first person to come up with a concept, perhaps in the Western world, is Leonardo, and he drew, you would recognize it as a parachute in a rather odd shape. Somebody actually built it, and a few decades ago, built it and see if it did work, which it sort of did, but it oscillated from side to side very unhelpfully. George Cayley, bless him, studied parachute and parachute design. and he found he had one built, and one Mr. Cocking, Robert Cocking, tried to use it, not very successfully, and he was the first, as far as we know, the first person to be killed in a parachuting accident in Vauxhall Gardens in London. And then there was no parachuting in this country right until about 1880-ish, although there was parachuting on mainland Europe. And a nice little hand stamp on the little cancel on the left-hand side here is actually incorrect. It's the 20th anniversary was of Learman jumping from a tower, and this is not, this is something else. This is Garnerin's descent from a hot air balloon, sorry, a balloon, and this parachute was already inflated with him hanging underneath in the basket. But nevertheless, it was a 200th anniversary, and I thought that was a nice stamp. So taking us up to the turn of the century, from the very late 19th century through to about 1912, 1913, one of the centres of parachuting in this country was Alexandra Palace in London, when every weekend in the season, which is roughly an extended summer, you would find parachuting activities along with fairs and all sorts of things for entertainment, and so parachuting was one of them. One of the proponents of it was this charming postcard, this lady, Dolly Shepherd, who was in the business from 1904 to 1912. She holds many firsts. She was the first person to rescue another person in midair when two of them went up on the same balloon, and one of the parachutists couldn't release their pin to drop, so she swung across to them at a few thousand feet and grabbed the around the waist, and they came down under one parachute. And in the Guinness Book of Records, she is recognised as the first mid-air rescue. You can see her uniform. It's more like, well, I'm not quite sure what it is, what you would call it, but for 1904, it would be considered somewhat risque for a lady to dress in what today you might call a jumpsuit. And she was by trade a milliner. I worked for her auntie, making hats all week, and on the weekend she would travel to one of the big fairs, Wolverhampton, Derby, Bristol, Oxford, where she would perform a parachute jump or two. Each jump she got £2 and 10 shillings, which doesn't sound an awful lot until you realise in that time frame the average wage was about £40 a year. So every time she did a parachute jump, it was £2 and 10 shillings. Then on Monday morning, she went back to work again. Her mother hated her doing the parachute jumps, and one of the reasons was every year, very approximately, 1 in 3 people, as they would themselves say, went away, which is a very polite way of saying they died, because the accident rate was so high. And Dolly Shepherd did it for 8 years, and after 8 years, she decided that she'd run her luck enough. If you go to Alexandra Palace, if you go down the right-hand aisle into the main hall, you'll find 3 big murals. The central mural is one of parachuting, and there is a very strong likeness of Dolly Shepherd to that, to her on that mural. It was such a big centre. And it died out largely because air balloons, hot air balloons, were no longer the flavour. We had the early aircraft coming in, and they were far more attractive, especially at the big fairs like Wolverhampton. On the right-hand side there, as I'm sure you all know, in the Edwardian times, it was considered the in thing to have disasters on postcards. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of trains going through brick walls or upturned lorries, and somebody would knock out a postcard for it pretty quickly. They didn't know at the time, but when they took this picture, but Lily Cove, who you see hanging there, that's Lily there, it actually died about 5 to 10 minutes after this picture was taken. She parachuted from about 1,000 feet. On the way down, she got close to water. Landing in water, even now, is considered very dangerous. So the idea was, they think, that she undid her belt, and just as she got to the right height, she jumped, thinking it was only a few feet into the water, but she totally misjudged it and didn't land in the water, but landed on hard surface from a lot higher than 3 feet, and was killed on impact. Interestingly, she only did this particular jump because her colleague, Dolly Shepherd, should have done it but was unwell, and she took over at the last minute. This postcard is particularly interesting. It's a hot air balloon, you can tell from the large spout at the bottom. The parachute, which is hooked onto the side here and is let go by a pin, which is pulled by one of these cords. At the moment, it's balanced by this, which is a bag of sand hanging off the other side of the balloon. So when, in this case, Lily pulled the cord, the parachute started to come down, she jumped, the balloon is now lopsided and will turn upside down, the hot air would come out and the balloon would drift to ground. And the owner of the balloon, who run all the shows, would employ a man in a cart to go and pick it all up again, reinflate it for the next show. But certainly Dolly Shepherd is considered by many as the mother of British parachuting. She lived to be a ripe old age, well into her 90s. In the First World War, she never parachuted ever again. In the First World War, she was a driver on the front, taking the senior officers around. And in the Second World War, she finished up being the senior air raid warden for public wardens in East London, where she lived. So she had an interesting career, to say the least. Okay, up until the First World War, parachutes were a bit of fun, a bit of entertainment, a bit of experimentation, but nothing over serious. The First World War come along, and reasonably quickly, observers in observation balloons started to carry parachutes because they were such an easy target for the enemy planes. They were shot down at a regular interval, and if they had sufficient holes in them, they would plummet pretty quickly. So the observers didn't have very long to get out, and so they did have parachutes. Unlike pilots in the First World War, largely the pilots did not have parachutes. There was a number of reasons. The one often cited is that the senior officers thought that a pilot would bail out at the first opportunity rather than fight to the end, or whatever was the noble thing to do. But most pilots didn't want them either, because in these days, don't forget, these were open cockpits, there was nowhere to store it, they were physically big, they were excuse me, they were weighty, and therefore the aerodynamics of the aircraft weren't as good as they should be. So many of the pilots didn't want parachutes in them. It's easy to say when you don't need one. It wasn't until the end of the war did the Germans have parachutes, but the last few months of the war, they did issue their pilots, because they were losing so many planes. They thought it would, they should really give them a fighting chance. The Americans, shortly after they turned up, they had parachutes, but as we all know, they came in at half time anyway. So they had them for about 6 months or so, and the British had them for the last couple of months. But largely throughout the 4 years, they were not considered to be a lifesaver at all. The top left-hand corner there, you'll see a nice stamp of Mr. Bigood, who was a well-known, in his day, French aviator, entertainer more than anything else. His party trick was an interesting party trick. He would go up in his single seat plane, fly around a bit, do a bit loop-the-loop and everything else. This is pre-First World War. Then he would parachute out. And of course, the crowd were then somewhat amazed what's going to happen to his plane, which landed safely on the field. Any suggestion that he had a small person flying the plane is totally outrageous. He made the mistake, though, of training lots of people before the war, including some Germans who later flew in the First World War against him, and one of them actually shot him down about a year into the war, which they were most apologetic for. And it was the first time when, for the funeral, the Germans flew over and dropped a wreath. And as an apology for shooting him down. There we are. So he was a well-known fighter ace in his own right. On the top right-hand side, you will see a nice bit of postal stationery from or about Samandra Brăsescu from Romania. If you've got half hour to spare, there's lots of information about her on the web. Basically, she was a village girl who saw a plane and loved it. By unknown means, she managed to afford some pilot lessons, and she was one of the first female pilots in Romania, and holds many first lady to fly, first Romanian to fly over the Alps, first lady to parachute in Romania, had many records flying around the Mediterranean, but she went in 1932 to the States, and she established a world record for the highest parachute jump of its day. As you may recall, a couple of years ago, some mad person jumped from over 100,000 feet, I think it was, or 80,000, I forget it was now, some ridiculous height with a parachute. So that figure of 28,000 feet has long been superseded. Interestingly, when she came back to Romania, she was feted by many people, including the Pope, who wanted an audience with her. So she was very well known, very well loved. Then the Second World War started, and she fought against the Germans. She actually commanded a flight of female pilots, and it was called, I think it was the White Flight or something like that. And they also took men from the front in their planes back if they were injured to get some medical help. When the Germans left and the Russians turned up, or the Soviets turned up, she fought against them as well. She had to go into hiding, and she died a couple of years later, it is believed, through some cancer or other. Nothing was then heard of her until the Berlin Wall came down. Then as soon as the Romanians were on their own, she became a national hero. There are roads in the capital named after her, and the Romanian parachute battalion are named after her. She's considered to be one of their great heroines. But jumping from 28,000 feet in that suit, yeah, best of luck. The one on the left-hand side is an interesting little cover, and there was lots of parachuting ideas around after the First World War. And this one had this wonderful title of the aerial mail dropping apparatus, which to you and me, you would call a parachute. And the idea was that somebody got 137 pieces of mail, apparently, and agreed with the postal authorities that they should demonstrate how effective this was, and they failed. As we all know, parachutes don't tend to drop in where you would like them. Wind and rain and all sorts of conditions will send them all over the place. And the equivalent of the postal authority in the States were not very impressed, so the guy never got the contract. But I've got one of the 137 envelopes there. In the interwar years, there were lots of first flights and the use of parachutes to drop mail, either because you couldn't land there or a particular place was on your route. The top left-hand corner there was in Hungary, and they dropped a number of envelopes at Goyo in Hungary. And I think it was a rather nice envelope. I haven't put any maps on here because otherwise it just gets too busy. But it wasn't a particularly long flight by today's standards, certainly, but that was one of the letters. The one on the top right was mail from mail to Relgon via Morel, and you can see from the stamp at the top there. And that's one of, I think, only 3 known. So I was very pleased to get my hands on that from 1920. So it's one of the first flight covers. And it's very similar at the bottom. There's a Johannesburg one, to the 6th Battalion, the King's African Rifles. And again, that one was dropped in 1929. Perhaps the most famous mail dropping was done by Zeppelins. There were many. I just got you two samples here. On the left-hand side, the Graf Zeppelin dropping mail to the German colony in Jaffa. Not many people realise there was a German colony there. I'm sure the irony is not missed on you at all. And they dropped, as I said, 5,000 in 3 bags, I think it was, of mail. And the one on the right-hand side, the Graf Zeppelin was not allowed to land when they wanted to come to England. They had some mail for the UK they wanted to show, so they dropped it at Orly, and it had to come from Orly back across the channel. But it came over the UK back in, again, 1930, this one was. So I rather like those two, but there's plenty of examples of mail being dropped by parachute, sometimes for political purposes. And the one I'm looking for, I'm still missing one I would love to have in my collection, is a Bathurst one from South America, and it was dropped to Bathurst with, I think it was the Graf Zeppelin did 3 runs across from South America to Bathurst in Gambia and back again. But I've yet to find a good example of that. Right, so that takes us up to the Second World War. And the Second World War, without any doubt, is the watershed for parachutes. Up until this point, they had been used largely for entertainment, a bit of experimentation, a bit of life-saving, but nothing nothing organised at all. We know the Russians had played around with, you know, handfuls of men under parachutes. So had the Germans. We hadn't really done a lot, nor had America. There was lots of thoughts about it, but nothing really came about it. And without doubt, Germany introduced parachuting to the world, certainly for the military, no two ways about it. On the left-hand side there, I've got some nice misaligned perforations on their workhorse, the Junkers 52, which was the vehicle they used for parachutists. They used paratroop forces at the start when they invaded Belgium and Holland. And the the postal station on the right-hand side actually is meant to depict the attack on the Belgian fort, which covered the river crossing into Belgium from Germany. And instead of a full frontal, they actually dropped on it from gliders, which was no mean feat, on top of this huge great fort, and to capture it and take it out of the battle. I think it's an excellent example of the winners write the history books, because virtually nothing is known about that engagement on the 10th of May, when a handful, less than 100 paratroopers, took a fort with, well, thousands of men inside. They obviously weren't expecting it, and that's why they did it. And by doing so, allowed the German forces to walk into Belgium and Holland, because the crossings were unguarded. Okay, in 1941, the Germans invaded Crete with their paratroop forces. Now, you probably don't know, but German parachutes in this time frame were not steerable. The lines which hold the parachute come down above their head, then straight down to them. And the advantage of that from a military perspective was all your men land together, which is good news. You don't want them scattered all over the place. The disadvantage is if it's very hilly, rocky, forest, whatever, then if one of them breaks their ankle, they all do. And that's largely what happened in Crete. So many of them were seriously injured when they could do nothing about landing on rocks and streams and gullies. Also, they made a serious mistake, which we repeated some years later, of jumping without their small arms with them. And So consequently, when the British and the Greeks fought back, they had to find their containers full of weapons first before they could fire back, which wasn't the cleverest thing in the world. Anyway, they landed on Crete, and for various reasons, they won. But Hitler was so incensed by the huge loss of manpower, he refused to let them fight again as a paratrooping force, and they fought as fancy infantry for the rest of the war. Interestingly, the forces in Crete, which included some of the paratroop forces, were the last but one to surrender on the 23rd of May, which was a good 2 or 3 weeks after everybody else. They would refuse. We left them there for about 6-9 months when the Germans were in retreat, and they couldn't get out, so they stayed there, and we made no attempt to dislodge them, and they wouldn't surrender to the Greeks. They point blank refused because they feared they'd all be killed, and they waited until the British came back with sufficient force to accept their surrender. I don't know if any of you know where the last place the German forces surrendered, but purely by chance, I thought this was rather interesting. The last German forces surrendered on the 4th of September because they had, before the war finished, had been sent to Spitsbergen to set up a weather station and reported back the weather conditions. But their radio broke. They knew the war had finished because they could receive, but their transmitter had broke, so there was no way of telling anybody that they were there, and they gratefully surrendered to a surprise Norwegian hunting party. They were there to hunt whales and seals on the 4th of September. I suspect they were getting fed up of eating fish, I should think, for nearly 3 or 4 months. Anyway, I digress. But Churchill loved what he saw. He thought they were parachute forces were good. So in June 1940, my lips are moving was almost what he said. A few weeks later, they started RAF at RAF Ringway, which is now Manchester Airport, the first training school for paratroopers, and I'll show you here. I just point out that this is a more allied version of the parachute, and you can see all the cords come down. If you pull on one of these, that's the direction you will go. By pulling it down, you lift up that side, air will come out like a jet stream, forcing you in the direction you pulled. But all the German parachutes finished up above your head, then came down, so you had no means of steering it. And for those of you who are into gardening or go to stately homes to visit, if you go to Tatton Park, you can find the little memorial, if that's the right word, to the fact that Tatton Park was the dropping zone, for the practice dropping zone for the Central Landing School during the war. So we try and catch up with them. We have a massive investment in the war of training lots and lots of men and women into parachuting. Our workhorse was the Dakota DC-3. Invariably, most people would start with a static line. You can see a static line here. So that's tied to the aircraft. That's tied to the top of the parachute. The man jumps, pulls the parachute out of the bag, and at the bottom, there's a small braking cord. So once you've got so much weight on the line, it would snap and you'd be finished out under the parachute, and that cord would be dangling out of the aircraft. I rather like this one. One of the big no-nos on landing with a parachute is never try and pull it to you. You have to run around it to deflate it. If you try and pull it towards you, all you're going to succeed in doing is looking very foolish. It's incredibly difficult to do. So these are sort of things they would practice many times in their grounds. The first time they used the parachute forces was apparently against this Italian viaduct. Their idea was to go and blow it up, and it was part successful. There was no means of getting the lads back, so it was a bit of a one-way trip when they parachuted in, but at least they proved that it could be of use. And lastly, just a sample. I've got a number of pages in my collection of SOE operatives who were also paratroopers. qualified to use the parachute. Many of them are household names, and sadly many of them never came back, but they were all over Europe. So what I'd like to show you is just a short clip of a video which gives you a flavour. And while this is running, I will, whoops, there we are. Let's see if it works. This wasn't for real, this was actually a practice run, and I know that because the weather wasn't pretty good. So there's no anti-aircraft fire. When I did this, I estimate there's about 600 men, 21 aircraft. There's about 20 odd aircraft there. They all would carry 28 men. So that makes about 600 altogether, of which you've just seen the first phase coming out. On D-Day, 23,000 men jumped from a total of, I think it was 2,000 planes. So it looks pretty busy already, so you can imagine what it must have looked like. I rather like this sunken die proof signed one. I rather like that. You can see the man here trying to steer his parachute here, pulling on the cords. Many of you will know of John Steele, the gentleman who got stuck up the church tower, depicted in films, and all he could do was watch the fighting below. He actually was captured for a couple of hours, but managed to escape. Yeah, sadly died at quite a young age, but he was a regular visitor back to St Mary Inglis. The weather on D-Day was actually appalling for parachuting. There were strong winds and low cloud. Paratroopers were scattered all over Normandy, almost literally. Some people jumped from 300 feet and some from 2,000 feet. The planes got lost, gliders got lost. So it's quite a miracle that there was any there to fight. Here we are. Right, moving on. The Americans had a lot of paratroopers trained. I picked this one, the triple nickels, the 555, the African Americans. They never actually went into battle. They were used as firefighters. They would jump close to a fire in North America or Canada. Because the Japanese would send up fire balloons to land on the forests, and these would put it out. I think every collection should have a reason to have Marilyn Monroe in it, and she was a parachute inspector in the factory where she was found, but she inspected parachutes on unmanned aircraft. The Free Poles, of course, had a significant parachute force, which was used at Arnhem as well. Post-World War II, parachute clubs all over the world. I rather like this cancel. That's rather nice. I like that. That's shown one of the more modern parachutes. Cessna 172, 182. I learned to parachute from one of these. In my day, I had to balance on the wheel, hold on until the instructor said go, then let go. That was good fun. And one of the things which to this day I remember is that it's so quiet. Under a parachute, you can't hear a thing. It's absolutely, it's amazing quiet. Parachutes used in other fields since the Second World War. The spaceflight, the Mercury Capsule, 63 feet in diameter, then 80 feet. The huge parachutes used to stabilize the shuttle on landing, 136 feet in diameter. They were quite massive. The unmanned ones, I think, are even more impressive. The Titan one, for 8 years, it's kept on the spacecraft, all crunched up in the deep cold of space. Then somebody presses the magic button and off it goes and it works. I think that's quite amazing, really. A wonderful piece of engineering. Going to Venus, again, quite a long time in freezing cold temperatures, to suddenly go up to 400 or 500 degrees as you go through the atmosphere with clouds of sulfuric acid. I don't think it's made out of silk, but never mind. Quite amazing. The military, lots of military uses since the Second World War, and virtually every country of note has some parachute forces. This was our venture into the Suez Canal in 1956, which didn't end well, as we know. The Belgians had better luck rescuing a lot of their people who had been held hostage by some rebels in 1964. You may recall that. The French tried to hold out at Dien Bien Phu by parachute supply. They lasted 8-9 weeks, something like that. The one I really do like is this one here. The Indian government supported Bangladesh in their War of Independence in '71. When West Pakistan invaded, well, sent troops to East Pakistan, the government was so incensed, this time West Pakistan had attacked them and tried to take them out of the war, that the Indian government sent their parachute brigade, and they dropped into Tangail, which was in between the Bangladesh capital and the West Pakistan forces, and basically dug in and waited for the opposition to turn up, and they wisely did not. This one I rather like. It was actually carried by the scouts from the Tangail front line back into the postal network. So I rather like that. I was rather pleased to get that. But parachuting supplies as well as people into earthquake zones or flooded areas or wherever have been used many times. Pitcairn Island actually had a bulldozer. I think it was Pitcairn had a bulldozer by parachute because that was anywhere they could get onto the island, which was an interesting idea. And of course, there's until the advent of the internet, parachuting mail into Arctic and Antarctic bases was certainly the quickest way of getting stuff in, particularly urgent medical supplies. And here are just two examples of the two Argentinian covers taken into their bases. Right. There are a number of people who have had fortunate or unfortunate experiences with parachutes. A number who have fell and survived. The Sunderland flying boat, who found itself over Norway looking for German warships, just as literally on the same day as war was declared and Germany invaded Norway, and the flying boat was shot down. Sadly, all the men on board but one died. One of them fell 3,000 feet into deep snow and survived. Amy Johnson, as you know, was a pilot for the ATA. She went missing on a journey carrying a plane down to the south coast. It is thought she came down in the Thames, and she was never found, although the plane was. And it didn't have its parachute on. They think she parachuted and found herself in the Thames. It's fairly controversial. There are a number of theories what happened to her, but sadly she perished. George Bush bailed out of his torpedo bomber and survived. The one I really like is Mr. D.B. Cooper, the only hijacking the FBI has never solved, still, from 1971. D.B. Cooper, because that is the name the person used, basically hijacked the 727, got all the passengers off, got $200,000 and 2 parachutes. All the crew were in the cockpit, and they noticed that the back door of the plane had been opened, something you can't do anymore. You have to be in the cockpit to do that. And when they went to have a look, he'd gone. And he had parachuted over, they think, Ariel in Washington State, the town of Ariel, which to this day, I can never remember what the date is, 24th of November. Every 24th of November, they have a big party about D.B. Cooper's success of beating the FBI, much to the annoyance of the local FBI, I suspect, but there we are. And they never found him to this day. They have found some of the money, a little bit of the money turned up, but they've never found him or a body, and they have no idea. The one I like, and I suspect you liked as well, was this one. when a fairly well-known person opened the Olympics a couple of years ago, no, a couple of Olympics ago. You might remember James Bond and Queen Elizabeth dropping in by parachute to open the 2012 Olympics. I rather like the idea myself. I thought it was very well done. So some more modern parachuting entertainment. You'll be pleased to know we're nearly at the end. Some modern entertainment, a nice uncut Golden Lion Scottish Air letter. I rather like that one, nice and colourful. The Red Devils used to be a big parachute display team. And the RAF Falcons are still in existence and giving shows in the summer months. Now, parachute competitions, there's many and varied. The first one was in 1951, and this is a cover, quite a nice cover from that time. In the good old days, there was only one competition, but now there are so many, they can't put them in one competition. There are dozens of world competitions. They do all sorts of things. This is from the 21st championship. You'll notice the different type of parachute, and this is far more accurate. In the good old days, you had to land in the center of a cross or close to a stick. And literally, if you got within a couple of meters steering one of these chutes, you were doing very well. These days, there's a 2 centimeter, and I mean 2 centimeter disc on the ground. If you touch the disc on landing first, you have 0 points. If you're 1 centimeter away from the disc, you get 1 point. 10 centimeters, 10 points. You do that 8 times, and the one with the lowest score wins. And people win with scores of 15 and things like that. And to do that 8 times is, even with a very steerable chute, is very, very impressive. Here we have some stacking parachutes. This hand stamp here. There's 4 showing here, where this one here will be sitting on top of that parachute. That parachutist will be sitting on top of that one all the way down. And last time I looked, the record was 22 on top of each other, which I think is quite impressive. And I thought you'd like this. If I can get it going, back there.
And we've all been here for about a week now. We had 3 planes flying the formation, dropping 63 people out of it and 5 camera flyers. It's definitely a dream for a lot of women to complete something like this and to take part in something like this. There was so much good energy on the ground. Everybody was constantly cheering us on and encouraging us, and the good vibes were just flowing everywhere. We completed the record on the 12th attempt. It was a 63-way. We beat the old record of 41 people.
Gotta be mad. Just a couple more slides. Base jumping, and that means base standing for buildings, antennas, span, and earth, span being bridges, where mad people jump off things. You'll see up here, this person jumping off this rock face here. He'd have a little drogue chute in here, which he'd chuck up as he jumps, and that pulls out the main chute. So you get a deployment of just a second or 2 quicker, which you obviously need if you're falling at a very short distance. Here, the Angel Falls in Venezuela. The biggest falls in the world, over 2,600 feet straight down. And people would stand on the top here and jump. It's quite impressive. I've seen some of the videos, but I think you've got to be barking mad. And this one here, the New River Gorge, which is in West Virginia, the local authorities were so fed up with people jumping from here illegally and getting killed on the rocks below, It's not that far, it's only about an 800 feet drop, that they decided that one day a year they would open it so long as it would run professionally. And to this day, people come in October and jump off from here, and it's quite spectacular to see. Thousands of people come to watch them, and they have rescue boats out in the water, and again, you have to be a little mad to do that sort of thing, but that's what they do. In all the American parks, base jumping is totally banned unless there's a special one-off event. Yosemite, in particular, for the El Capitan, a number of people have been killed jumping from the top of there, and still to this day they legally do it. The police, the authorities, the park rangers have got so fed up. If they catch you, not only will you be prosecuted, but it's compulsory confiscation of all your equipment, your helmets, your jackets, or, the clothing you're wearing, your parachute, your boots, the lot. But people still keep coming back, and they catch someone every now and again. The shortest jump is inside St Paul's Cathedral from the Whispering Gallery. I'm sure many of you have been to the Whispering Gallery. Somebody has jumped from that, then run very fast out of the door, abandoning their parachute. And that's why when you go to St Paul's and they search your bag, they are not looking, well, they are looking for any weapons or Semtex or anything else. They're looking to see if you have a parachute, because they were totally embarrassed when it happened. 102 feet, it's not very far. If you are in Paris with your loved one, and you're a bit fed up going around the shops, then could I suggest a trip to the Eiffel Tower? And just before you get there, you put in your loved one's bag, a rather large carrier bag, and write parachute on. Then you'll have the afternoon to yourself, because your loved one will be care of the police, because they are absolutely fed up with a number of people who try to jump from the Eiffel Tower. As you can see from its shape, no matter where you jump from, you haven't got to go far before you hit metalwork, and people do on a regular basis. And the number of people killed on the Eiffel Tower apparently is terribly bad for business. When they did the James Bond film, A View to a Kill, there's a scene in there where James Bond, Roger Moore in this one, actually chases the baddie with a wonderful name of Mayday up here, and she jumps from here. That particular jump was allowed once. They had 22 rehearsals from a hot air balloon to get it exactly right, and they had lots of cameras all over the place to try and capture it so they could do it just once. But she cheated. If you ever do see that film and you see that bit where she jumps off, if you look behind her, it's quite clear as she falls, she's falling off a ramp which had been put out over, hanging off the Eiffel Tower. But yes, incredibly dangerous place to jump. And lastly, we take full circle back to where this all started, the very first parachute jump back in 1617 from Venice. This is where I started with the very first item where the hand stamp was wrong. That's what it should have looked like. And he had a wooden frame with canvas between it, jumping off this tower. And in many ways, you could say this was the first base jump as well. But let me just finish with one more video, which only lasts a minute. I think for this, you need to be strapped in and hold tight. If I can find the right start. Somewhere about there, and look for the wheelchair. I shall ask you if you've noticed the wheelchair. Okay, oops, right there. This is base jumping from a building park. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you, Barry. Not the faint-hearted, that last bit, I think.
Yes.
My worst nightmare, I think that was.
I hope you saw the wheelchair. Wheelchair parachute are not quite common, but there's many of them.
Barry mentioned that parachutes have been around for quite a long time, and I thought these two miniature sheets here, issued by the Republic of Palau in 1997, summed up an awful lot of usage of parachutes. I mean, we saw many of these examples in Barry's talk today, and I thought this was a wonderful assemblage of all the different ways in which parachutes are used. Personally, I'm very fond of the picture of the F4 Phantom over here on the 60-cent stamp. I have fond memories of F4 Phantoms at an RAF station where I used to live. But I thought that was a rather nice selection of stamps there, featuring the many ways in which parachutes can be used. Actually, Barry, I think you included that stamp on the left there, the $2 one. What an amazing training tower that they had in Fort Benning in Georgia for the American soldiers to learn how to parachute. And we see on the right-hand side an example of how a safety chute can obviously be used to slow down a car if it runs out of control at a speedway event. So we've seen a lot of stamps today. I thought it might also be nice to have a quick look at just a few postcards that are relevant. I think this is an amazing thing. As you were explaining, Barry, in the early years, they didn't really encourage people to bail out of aircraft, but this artist's impression shows something happening in 1930, where that chap had just jumped out of the aircraft we see in the foreground, and we can see some of his colleagues in the distance have also recently deployed from that other aircraft. I looked up that plane. As you see, that particular one was operated by 27 Squadron, and then all of those DH-9As then went to 60 Squadron. You mentioned, of course, the use of paratroops in the Second World War. These two postcards, obviously with pictures by the war artists at the time, show, as we see, the Italian paratroops landing and starting to use their weapons. Notice in particular in the middle here where they're getting their weapons out of some canister that have been dropped separately, which I think was a point you were making about the fact that the weapons obviously couldn't carry all of their weapons with them as they descended, but only some of the smaller ones.
This is a guy who's not running around his parachute, but trying to pull it down, isn't it?
I think he does look like he is, doesn't he? Yeah, he does seem to be struggling with it, because pretty obviously trying to pull all that silk towards you, it fills with air, a lot of resistance there. This next pair of postcards, if you notice, they're numbered AP1 and AP10. There was a series of 10 postcards relating to the paratroops in the United States, and they were all produced in the same style. They're sort of linen style cards, and I thought they just show this point about obviously boarding the transport plane and then later descending onto their objectives. And very good example of the sort of thing that Barry was explaining with all the lines coming down towards the parachutists there. That training tower in Fort Benning was also featured on a postcard there on the left. And of course, it wasn't just the US Army Air Corps that used parachutes. The US Navy did as well. And so we see some parachute troops there on the right-hand side. Again, official US Navy photographs being used for that postcard. Yeah, I think again, this chap on the right needs to learn about gathering up his parachute, doesn't he, Barry? He doesn't look like he's
certainly does.
quite got it right, but he is trying, and it looks like it's hard work the way he's doing it. But there's a couple of postcards, obviously, of U.S. Army parachutists descending and then obviously having landed, gathering up their chutes. The next few slides are some relevant bit of humor relating to parachutes. So this cartoon was published in Punch in August 1932. And as we see, the inventor of a parachute inventor there at the front, he's speaking to the airman. He says, "Now do your very best. If it doesn't open, I'm ruined." So I think the airman's looking quite shocked at this, but one would hope that it worked. Now, of course, in World War II, people were encouraged to knit things and make things for the troops. And I see that Granny on the left there has knitted a lovely parachute. I'm not sure what the young man's making of it. That was published in a magazine in America in July 42. And you mentioned about the fact that these things were quite bulky when the airmen wore them. You can see the lady on the right is a bit puzzled by why he's got quite so much stuff behind him. And she thought that maybe that was a cushion to make it a bit softer for him when he was sitting on his pilot seat. There were a series of cards produced by a company called MWM in Aurora, Missouri, and they all related to parachute-related humor. And here we see a couple of them. Particularly like the one on the left, the play on words about landing in occupied territory. I thought that was rather fun.
That one on the left-hand side is the censored version. There's an uncensored version. That card almost certainly is a war bond stamp on the back. And to make it war bondable, it had to be suitable for a G rating in the States, which means anybody could buy it. The original had the lady with stockings, but apparently the thought of young people seeing a lady with stockings and stocking tops was too outrageous, so it had to be censored. And there's a couple like that, and having the before and after one is quite interesting. But that's a good example.
Yeah, and the one on the right as well. Yes, we don't see her stocking top, so she's climbing into the aircraft. So yeah. So that's a couple of those in the series. I've got a few more from the same series here. I think that one's rather fun on the left. Yoo-hoo, I'll be right down as they step out of the aircraft. And yeah, the one on the right has definitely got a bit of a problem if they haven't been taught how to open it. But there we are. Obviously, these are, American humor aimed at all of these are wartime, by the way. All of these are from the 1940s. Oh yeah. The one on the left is interesting. It's one of those cards for people who don't want to write a long message. They just tick all the boxes that apply. So, dear friend, I just got in by rail. I've been in the clink. I need a new parachute. You just tick the boxes that you want to tick as you descend, apparently. From your transport plane. Not sure whether that will actually be used that way, but it's rather fun. And of course, the chap on the right seems to have forgotten something, his overshoes. So he's decided not to just jump, but he needs his shoes apparently. That one on the left, I don't know whether there was a censored version of that or not, but the chap there doesn't seem too bothered that he seems to have descended onto the telegraph pole. And got himself very tangled up with it. But he's, as you see, held up there for a short time, observing obviously somebody taking a bath. But the other two chaps do not look happy, do they? The one in the middle especially so, and the one on the right, he just looks totally fed up with the fact that he's basically had a bird strike, hasn't he? All these birds have settled on him. So again, this is just examples of American humor relating to parachuting during World War II. Yeah, in sort of yeah, sort of 42 through 45, that sort of time frame. We mentioned skydiving, and we saw some lovely examples with those videos and so on. I think this kind of sums up, Barry, the sort of thing that I think your instructor must have thought, which is, if at first you don't succeed, you don't succeed. Because of course, if at first you don't succeed, then skydiving probably isn't for you. Yeah, I mean, if you get it wrong, you'll know about it.
There's an interesting quote, and I've forgotten who it was now, which said, it's not true that you need a parachute to skydive. You do need a parachute to skydive twice.
That's it. Yep, very good. I always like this quote. I've heard it before many times. The mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. I think that's very true. So I do like that little card. And what I'd like to say is to everybody, cheers for dropping in, and thank you for your presentation, Barry. It's been really interesting and very, very enjoyable. So thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.